Greetings, adventurers. It's Chris, aka NAS, with Commander the Gathering. Before we start the video, I'm going to apologize. The way you hear my voice is the way that this mic and headset should sound, but during the video, I was a bonehead and had it too close to my mouth. So, I thought about going and redoing the video, but it may sound trivial to some people, but if I did that, it would not seem genuine to me. The laughs and the chuckles as I'm going through it, it would seem kind of fake and rehearsed, and I don't feel comfortable doing that. I apologize for the lack of quality, and you'll be able to hear me. It just sounds like I don't have a nose or that someone shoved a bunch of marbles in there. It's very nasally and awkward. I apologize. I hope you forgive me, but more importantly, I hope everything's going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. So, cheers. Greetings, Planeswalkers. It's Chris, aka Nas, with Commander the Gathering. First, I'm trying out my alternate headset and mic, so I hope it's not too different. I just want to see how it sounds and how this feels. That nonsense out of the way, I hope everything is going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. Today we take our last glimpse into Bolas Citadel, and yes, we did indeed save the best for last. This deck is tricky. I wanted to pay homage to Bolas, but also be viable, so in that, I've done my best. I'd love to know your thoughts below. And the TLDR is anything that is not directly related to Bolas, either via the card, the picture, its flavor, or something along those lines. It does something very Bolas-like. So the end result is it's a little more janky walkthrough in that this deck is a bit more unique in my opinion, as there's so much flavor to try to pack into one deck, and only so much you can do without avoiding or sacrificing function, and thus making the deck boring to play. One card is missing from here, some may point out, and if so, let me know in the comments if you notice it. I'm not going to explain in the video why it's missing, but will if someone points it out. This is opening a lore can of worms, so to speak, so I'm kind of interested in what kind of cards you think will be, quote, missing as is, regardless of if it's the one I'm talking about or not. And one thing of note up front is I do not have a Scarab God in this deck. Sadly, he's expensive, and I have only one, and he's piloting his own deck, so maybe one day. And Santa Claus, if you're listening, or if any of you got, the in with Santa, see if he can pitch me a Scarab God. I wouldn't be mad or upset, especially if it's one of the old Amonkhet invocation cards. I am going to be praying to Bolas this December. Now a short version of the maintenance and context building here. I have over 60 commander decks and no one to play with, so this FNM series, 11th out of however many there will be, is about exploring those decks and the spins I put on each of them to make them unique and fun to play. So we've tackled the three gods, Loke Dog, Scary Gary, and Scorpion God. He needs a cool, catchy name. Then we applied max stacks of sacks to Thrax, and amassed an army of zombie Eternals in the process. As mentioned above, the cards here will either reflect Bolas directly, be affiliated with him, reference him, or reflect or embody him in some way. I'll try to point it out when it's not obvious. Blah blah nonsense out of the way, the king is risen. Nicol Bolas the Ravager. He's a 4/4 Elder Dragon for 1 and Grixis colors, which is blue, black, and red, for a total converted mana cost of 4. He has the following abilities, starting with the simple one, Flying. Then, whenever he ETBs, enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. His last ability reads, pay 4 generic and Grixis to exile Nicol Bolas, then return him to the battlefield transformed under his owner's control only at sorcery speed. When flipped, he is Nicol Bolas the Arisen. He's now a Planeswalker with 7 loyalty counters to start. His abilities now read as follows. +2 loyalty counters to draw 2 cards. -3 loyalty counters. Nicol Bolas deals 10 damage to a creature or Planeswalker. -4 Put target creature or planeswalker from a graveyard to the battlefield under your control. And -12, exile all but the bottom card of target player's library. Now let's talk about all this for a moment. When you cast him for 4 mana, relatively cheap, each opponent discards a card and you have a 4/4 flying dragon, which is not bad at all. This offers an interesting spin and opportunity here in that you can actually still use and manipulate the game with Nicol Bolas as a creature card and potentially commander damage opponents out, but also sets up the potential and flexibility to use a planeswalker side. And that flip side planeswalker portion is amazing. He's a big body at 7, so he can take some damage up front, but if you have established blockers or a way to stop people from attacking you, that gives you even more flexibility to use the +2 to build him up and draw cards. But if he comes out with no creatures on your end to protect him, first, based on the power of the creatures on the board, you could roll with that. Perhaps you intend to just -3 him, blow up another threat, and there's only 2 power on the board, which will give you time to establish something next turn. But another option is to pull a creature from a graveyard. Maybe even one Bolas had a player discard when entering the battlefield, and pull it out to protect Bolas. This to me shows the flexibility of Bolas in the lore. He's always prepared even for the unexpected and has one or several answers or responses already in place. Now let's delve inside of Bolas' Citadel for the last time, starting as we always do with lands. With these lands in mind and cards that you'll see later, I realize I need Proliferate in this deck, but it's so hard to work in with as I keep talking about function over flavor. So maybe one day we'll see about working some of it into here. These 3 lands kind of touch on that, and they're all from Fallen Empire. We have Bottomless Vault, Sand Silos, and Dwarven Hold, black, blue, and red respectively. At my upkeep, I need to decide to either tap this or leave it tapped and add a counter to it. In the event I opt not to tap it to charge it and instead to tap it to use 4 mana, I can tap it and remove as many counters as I feel I need for mana at that point. In a perfect world, these could be proliferated. Pipe dreams of proliferation aside, let's move on to some more flavorful and themed cards. We have Crypt of the Eternals, Cascading Cataracts, and Interplanar Beacon. And then more function over flavor, but definitely on theme with helping to either protect a planeswalker or myself from being attacked in Mystifying Maze and Labyrinth of Skolphos. And then I can potentially clone those lands or any other land on the battlefield with Thespian Stage. Now here's the part where, like clockwork, I mentioned that to see the rest of the lands or the deck list as a whole, there's a link to this deck and all of the decks that I've covered thus far in my FNM episodes below. Lands and maintenance aside, now we have what I call my static artifact, starting with mana enhancers. I think this happened last video or recently enough that I recall it, but we have a pair of rings, Soul Ring and Replicating Ring, and also deja vu like, albeit only initially, a pair of signets, this time Arcane and Rakdos. The last pair of cards, the Indestructible Darksteel Ingot and a Manascape Refractor. This card is and does a lot, so enjoy the read, but in one word, potential. Now we have another prime example of a non-Bolas related card that does exactly what Bolas would do. When it enters the battlefields, it becomes a copy of any artifact on the battlefield, and please note that it does not say it has to target that artifact. This could be a mana rock already seen, perhaps something an opponent has, including artifact, creatures, or equipment. Or perhaps Magistrate's Scepter, another proliferate target, or a Netherborn Altar, the opposite of a proliferate target. This card I can't wait to find a home for in a black and white deck so I can pair it with Solemnity. That combination just seems absurd to me, especially if you have perhaps a sacrifice-related commander, where you want to actively shuffle it back and forth, perhaps using enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield triggers to abuse them. Whew, I can't wait to look into this. Gray and brown bordered artifacts aside, we move now onto enchantments. Making his second appearance, I believe, is Curse of Opulence, then Black Market and Stolen Strategy. The former nets me black mana at my pre-combat main phase each time a creature dies, and counters stack. And Stolen Strategy lets me play, hopefully, some of your best spells, and hopefully again with some of the mana provided by the prior two cards. On the control side, albeit more subtle, this trio starts with a pair of similar cards, Telepathy and Seer's Vision. Both allow me to have opponents play with hands revealed, and the latter allows me to potentially force a discard by sacrificing the enchantment if I choose. And then one of my favorite cards in the game, Leyline of Anticipation. Where'd you go? I'll just flash you in real quick. There we go. Which allows me to potentially play it for free and then play cards as though they had flash after that. And I can flash in game enders like Sunbird's Winvocation and Swarm Intelligence. These two cards in tandem can be cataclysmic for opponents. Some instants and sorceries, starting with Brutal Expulsion, Rescue from the Underworld, and one of my favorite cards ever, and newly reprinted in some amazing art and featuring a lore reference for a character from when I was playing. And notice that third hand coming out of nowhere. Where was I? Let me see. Okay, Dark Ritual, yeah. I love the new art. It's very Strixhaven-ish. And this card is just explosive, especially if you have the potential to copy it. Onto the slower side of slinging, we have our two sorceries, Beacon of Tomorrow and Settle the Score. Beacons gives a target player an extra turn and reshuffles into the deck, and the latter card exiles a target creature. Then I put two loyalty counters on a planeswalker I control. Keep in mind that the way the card is read, if that creature gets hexproof or is sacrificed to remove it as a target, the second condition still does resolve, regardless of whether the first part does actually target a creature or not. Then two creatures that are pure function and do what they do very well. Clever Impersonator and Geth, Lord of the Vault. The Shapeshifter is tricky as it can become a copy of a non-land permanent, Sol Ring for example, a commander, a planeswalker, or Sunbird's Invocation. One interesting thing here is I can clone the planeswalker side of my commander, thus destroying the permanent that was on the battlefield already, send it to my command zone, and then recast Nicol Bolas as the dragon and have both the commander dragon and commander planeswalker out at the same time. And then we just have Geth. I love it. He plunders opponents' graveyards of creatures and artifacts and then smacks you in the face by milling you on the way out for more bait for later. And he does not tap. And now for the love of Bolas. And these cards again are all more heavily Bolas themed and related. We start with a few other planeswalkers serving under Bolas. We have Ral, Storm Conduit, Tezzeret the Schemer, and I think I have Agent of Bolas somewhere in another deck that I can't find, and I may replace it. We'll see, and I'll update later. And Liliana Dreadbore General. I'll let it linger for a moment in case you want to read them, but all of these have served under Bolas throughout the story at some point. A trio of Bolas-themed creatures, starting with Soul Diviner, Disciple of Bolas, and Augur of Bolas. These next four cards, pairs in paired or paired in pairs, however I would say that, are all meant to honor and pay homage to Bolas. We have the one non-legendary God Pharaoh's Gift, and then the legendary God Pharaoh's Statue, because sometimes you have to pay to play, literally. These two are both legendaries. We have Throne of the God Pharaoh and Bolas' Citadel, which we've seen several times throughout this series. Then an instant and two sorceries, starting with Soul Manipulation with the Bolas quote, and then two finales, first of Revelation and then Promise. Once more, I'll let it linger, but feel free to pause before we move on. And moving on, we go to Wit's End and Apex of Power. Seeing someone playing with a hand size matters deck after playing Wit's End, it just makes my cynical soul smile. Two more sorceries, Slave of Bolas, which is just an awful card if you think about the fact that he's just dominating an angel in the art, which is one of the embodiments of good, and then another game ender, Torment of Hailfire. This card has to be here. Moving on, a lot of these are more flavor over function and may require a little bit of lore explanations, so let's launch into this. Diabolic Revelation is a good tutor here, but it also has a wonderful quote that references Grixis, which Bolas has ties to, and I love that quote. Crux of Fate is a card I love because, Bolas aside, I generally do not like or use dragons. Lore-wise, I hate this card because it kind of represents what I do not like about Tarkir and the Ugin story. And the TLDR, Ugin got beat so bad that they had to work some way to remake his history in time. Bolas crushed him that bad. In Khans of Tarkir, it is as things should have been. Humans persevered over dragons, fought tooth and nail for everything, to beat a group of beings that were by all means superior. But to help save Ugin, the story was rewritten, had Ugin saved by Sarkhan, and this meant that dragons in Tarkir now essentially became limitless, and in that capacity, humans have now, in Dragons of Tarkir, been subjugated and enslaved. Not before an enemy that is stronger, faster, cunning, and more capable now, no. The dragon's power lie in the fact that from the dragon nexus, infinite dragons just keep coming. And that is it. If there were not infinite dragons, or if there were infinite humans to counterbalance that, things would be different. And to me, it highlights the weakness of the dragons and even elder dragons that were not only defeated by humans, but had to have this whole history rewritten. It's just such a bummer. And I do not have respect for Ugin or Sarkhan or that branch of the story based on yet. Yes, there's a lot more to it, and I'm not saying that I'm right. I tend to lean heavily towards villains and enjoying them. I believe it is the villain that the worth and merit of the hero is based on. So if you have weak, easy, and unentertaining, unrememberable villains, you have the same in the hero. Anyway, the flavor text captures that. Ugin being so weak, he begs a mortal for help. My favorite part, though, is the art. It shows Bolas uppercutting or choking Ugin out prior to all of this. Cruel Ultimatum shows Bolas mentally blasting Sarkhan, so I love this card by default. The Eldest Reborn is a saga card that some mortals think is just a saga and not a cycle. Two of the three Amonkhet gods, Scorpion and Lokdog, and as mentioned, no Scary Gary yet. Rakamar is another reference that goes back to Grixis and the such. She's actually associated with Jund, but was manipulated and used by Bolas, and I love the flavor text. Sadly, she was killed by a Johnny, the murderous cat. Oh, speaking of Grixis, it's Thraxamundar. I didn't talk much about his lore in his deck video, saving it for here, but he's a bloodthirsty, berserking hulk of a warrior who's classified as an assassin. He's chaotic, and he reminds me of Khorne from 40k in that Khorne says, "I do not care where the blood flows, only that it flows." And Thrax embodies that in his lore and in his abilities. He will just kill, sacrifice. If there's idling and nothing is being killed, he'll turn on his own people. Sadly, as he's a product of a far gone era when there was little to no lore, that's about all you get on him. Speaking of old cards with little lore, but a little bit more, Herald of Leshrac. This card is perfect here. A lore reference, flavor, it steals your stuff. Such a Bolas card. And as mentioned with lore, Leshrac was a character that could use some love, but he was killed by Bolas early in the MTG storyline. A pair of Kefnits, first the Mindful and then the Eternal form, followed by another Eternal in Bantu. This cycle is one I'd like to flesh out more at some point. Now the process between turning a living thing, either a god or a creature, into an Eternal is basically the same. Essentially, you power up a living thing as much as you can in life, then you kill it, raise it as a zombie inside of Lazotep. Then it can now travel across planes as organic material cannot. That is what the Eternal Army was for Bolas, an army capable of going plane to plane, conquering in Bolas's name as only basically individual planeswalkers could at that time. The reason I'm mentioning that is I'm going to show you my little spin I'm adding here that I may add on to later. You may or may not have noticed up front there was no equipment, and here they are. I look at these in this deck as parts of the process to becoming an Eternal. Sadly, one card I'm missing that I know I have, but have defined as Lazotep Plating. We'll start first with the least impactful Swiftfoot Boots. A bit of a reach, but I learned from Achilles, protect everything, even your heels and your feet. Lower halves protected, now we have to find a brain bucket like we used to say in the Marines. So we have Cranial Plating. This card is awesome because you can also attach it at instant speed. Feet and head, now protected, we have to protect our body with Nim Deathmantle. And the concept of the Eternal set actually started here. Nim Deathmantle embodies the eternalizing process to me. The creature has Nim Deathmantle attached to it, and he's out there doing his thing until he dies, perhaps by board wipe, by combat, or perhaps Bolas's hand itself. If a creature dies, I can pay 4 mana, then I return that creature to the battlefield, essentially eternalizing it and equipping the mantle to it. Now that creature is a zombie, buffed, and has Intimidate, and that whole process screams eternalized to me. Now, my own fantastical spins out of the way, we're going to move on to Dominaria's most ancient evil, Nicol Bolas. This card is a reprint of his first card, and I have that old ugly one also. I was so happy when they re-released this card, and I'll put up the image of the original perhaps, but the point is they just missed on the art. When you see that old one, it just doesn't scream Dominaria's most ancient evil. This card also represents Nicol Bolas pre-Spark, just as an Elder Dragon. Getting closer to said Spark, we have first Deliver Unto Evil and Dark Intimations. Both are here because they interact generally with Bolas Planeswalkers. So I'll leave them up for a second, and then move on to Visage of Bolas. An amazing card here. It's a mana rock, but it costs 1 more because it allows me to go and grab Nicol Bolas, the Deceiver. I like these cards because they allow you to grab the card usually from either the graveyard or from your library. Next we have Nicol Bolas, Planeswalker. These abilities are brutal and just so Bolas. Elevated still, we have Nicol Bolas, God Pharaoh, a 4 ability Planeswalker. And finally, my favorite art, my favorite Bolas, Nicol Bolas, Dragon God. And so, thank you for hanging out. This walkthrough was about as janky as the deck and unusual for me to do because it's a little bit all over the place with a lot of stuff interjected that none of you may care about. If you're here for the cards, you don't care about the lore, perhaps, and vice versa. So I hope it was entertaining and short enough. Thanks for spending this time with me. Old Bearby, you and Tommy Bear now owe me a number. I don't know what's taking you this long. What have you been waiting for? Slackers. But we will see you then, and I hope everything's well with you and you are all taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. Cheers.